Hello and welcome back to Election Time News America. Today is Friday, September 5th, 2025. We're looking at the House elections in the United States of America. We're looking at for the 2026 midterms. Election Time News runs up our own things, elections and politics, from summations to poll reviews and news. Subscribe below for more content like this about American, Canadian, and Australian elections. Also, make sure to follow the Substack, Threads, Instagram, and X. All those are linked on the profile on YouTube. And remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. So, getting right into things already, we do have the overlook from Wikipedia here. We can see we do have the court struck down the map in Utah, so that is now also to be decided. We have quite a few retirements, mostly people moving up, so that's going to be an interesting thing of note there, but quite a few retirements across the country. Now they're starting to stack up. Half of the delegation in Iowa is retiring as well, so that could potentially open things up a bit. But this is a very red district. It didn't even go blue back in 2018 when Democrats won the national House vote by 8. So that's going to be something interesting there. In theory, they could potentially pull off something there. Currently vacant vacancies in these three, which have been moved. That's purple. I believe that is currently vacant due to Democratic and Republican incumbent. Both a Democratic and Republican live in that district, so that is going to be an interesting face-off. That could actually end up being relatively close, but it is a very red district in general. So start things off here. We have the general safe map: 151 seats for Republicans, 119 for Democrats, 165 are rated as toss up, and that's going to be everything essentially that's under 20 points. Now, this is going off of the assumption that the California vote is going to pass, because generally it does appear that that is going to happen, and I don't think there actually is a market on here yet, but there is going to be a so there's nothing on that, but it's relatively likely. It is more likely than not that Proposition 50 will in fact pass in the state of California, and so this will end up being the map in California. Not 100% sure about all of that, but here are the two maps. We have Texas and California, so that's going to be the main things to watch here, and so that's what we're looking at. For the general map, all these were under 20 points we're looking at in 2024. So, to start off, we do have the, uh, getting real quick here, we do have, let's get to the less competitive districts. These are ones that are generally actually are in solidish colors on here, which means that there are more than 10. But to quickly go over them a bit. So let's start over on the west. That's actually a safe district because it was just two Republicans. Before that, in 2022, it was against a Democrat and they won by 35. So it's actually not a competitive district. It was just between two Republicans, so it was somewhat competitive in 2024. So that is the reasoning behind that and why it is still solid red on the map here. So first off, we have here is the outer Seattle area, Washington's 8th district. Schreier is in this district. That's going to be a main thing here. Kim Schreier won in 2024 by just over nine. Um, and so that's gonna be an interesting one. There's basically nobody here right now. There's not even anything close to a page for it. As of right now, that's just gonna be likely blue for the time being. Perez actually was expected to lose in 2024. Trump won the district by 3.3, yet she won, and so that was definitely unexpected. She won by 3.9%, so quite a bit of an overperformance in that district. And she was also expected to lose. This was said to be a generally competitive one in the polling by Signal. They did have Perez up by 4, but that was all the way back in June. And I think there were a few other smaller, less recognized polls that did actually have her down a bit, but she did end up winning after all. So this is going to actually be a lean DC, especially with the expected environment of being -4 on the House. which is not necessarily close to 2018, but somewhat of a relatively strong year. Definitely better than 2024, also better than 2022, right about a bit better than 2020, in which this is what the House map looked like in 2020, where the Democrats won it by 9 seats. So very, very, very close. Actually, they held on to control of the House by 9. So next we're looking up in the 6th district, 13.6. That wasn't safe. The reason for that's 20 is because House districts are generally a bit more variable than the rest of it and generally less nationalized. So you could see potentially a 20-point shift, even though nationally would actually only be about a 7-point shift because it depends a lot on candidates. Salinas in the 6th district. This is going to be a likely seat. So is the one also on the coast here with Hoyle. Bynum flipped this seat in 2024 by 2.7%. This is going to be a relatively strong candidate here, though. So what we end up having here, general election, they did have it relatively tilt D, lean D at the end. All of the polls did have Bynum leading, but even the Democratic one only had her leading by 2 in the final poll, so that was a bit of a concern there. But did de-seat the incumbent by just 2.7% after she won her first term by 2.1 in 2022 after redistricting gave Oregon another seat. So that's why that's there. So that's going to be a tilt blue, just because generally also you have the incumbency plus the fact that it's going to be a slightly blue environment. Hopping over here real quick to the only truly competitive seat in the northern Great Plains is going to be Montana's 1st district with Zinke. This was expected to be relatively competitive, but apparently Zinke had actually originally expressed interest in running for U.S. Senate against Jon Tester. He decided not to do so, and then of course it actually ended up he ended up losing anyway. But this is the end result here for the candidates. Relatively red 1st district, but the 2nd district's relatively red, but the 1st district ended up being a slight win for Zinke here by about 7.5 points, 32 in the eastern 2nd district. And so, obviously, relatively strong performance there. All of them had a lean R, and then ended up being somewhat stronger than expected there, even with a 6-point lean likely split, still ended up being stronger. Zinke is generally going to be a bit of an overperformer, most likely. So that is then going to end up leaving this be a likely for this as well, potentially being right on the edge of lean, but even with the blue environment, it's probably not going to be enough. Now, this was just barely under 20, was 19 points, but that was also due against non-Democrats. It was actually 22 against Democrats in 2022, but nonetheless, that's generally going to be very safe there. All of these are slightly gerrymandered. It should be closer to 2-2 here, but these all break off the Democratic regions in the Las Vegas region, which is still shifting to the right, so potentially Nevada's 3rd might be in a bit of trouble. But as of right now, they're going to be all likely Democrat, even though this one is a bit of an underperformer. It's only 2.7. As of right now, it's expected to be a blue environment, and you also end up with potentially concerns with that area in general with the potentially collapsing tourism industry in Nevada. So here's the thing about the new map here. Most likely you're going to have these continue to be safe districts. I'll drag this up real quick. And you end up with this frilly one being the safest red. These two are likely going to be pretty red, and there's one in the middle over here that's also relatively red. But then other than that, all of these other ones are relatively blue to some degree. Not exactly sure how blue. It does say 5 to 10 points for a lot of these. So for the most part, just filling in all of these likely as of right now before we have any further information on them. But these are actually less than 5 points. So these could end up actually, in theory, being a dummy matter depending on how well the Republicans end up doing. But as of right now, it does appear that because they also have incumbents in these areas, it's likely going to end up being relatively strong performance across the board. So this is going to be a relatively large concern for the Republicans, considering that this is going to be a net pickup of quite a few seats here for the Democrats at the end of the day, if Prop 50 does pass, which as of right now it does look like it will, and now the Democrats and Republicans are almost tied with 124 more to go. Going over to Alaska, Mary Peltola is not running for her House seat. She has made that clear, which means that Big H is almost certain to win the seat. That just generally means as of right now, there's not. How's it get intricate? Um, doesn't mean necessarily right now there might not that there won't be a Democrat that potentially does relatively well. It just means that as of right now, there's no sign that there will be one that does relatively well. So that's the main thing about that. Moving over to Arizona, we have Gozar's seat, which is the only safe one for Republicans. Biggs was 20.8, but he is retiring. So that is going to be an interesting thing of note there. He's retiring to run for governor. So that is interestingly going to make things a bit more interesting. It's not actually saying anything about him having retired. I think it probably will on this page. It does show on his district. No, it doesn't. Apparently, it's not official. He was potential. So maybe in that case, he actually hasn't officially announced, in which case, either way, it is still 20 points or so. That would be expected to go that way. Hamadeh only won by 13. That would potentially be a flip. Now, the interesting thing is about Siska seat only won by 2.5 in 2024 and is also likely going to retire to run for governor. So that altogether does actually end up going together for potential blue flip. As of right now, very, very narrow Democratic lead, but still enough to put that on there. Schweiker, I don't think that he actually was expected to announce that he's retiring for anything. That's going to be a bit closer. Stanton, 7.3. That's didn't mean to do that. 7.3. That's not that strong of a performance, but enough to stay there. And Crane, likely only a lean margin. Depends on how well the turnout game does in that region. We'll have to continue seeing how things go there. New Mexico, these two are basically safe. They're just over 12.5 points. For the Democrats, this is going to be the competitive one yet again. The southern one, Vasquez won by 4.2 after narrowly flipping the seat in 2022 by 0.7. That was after they redrew the districts to make it more favorable for the Democrats so they could win all three. 4.2 points, most likely going to do even better in a blue wave year. That's probably going to end up being a likely seat there. Now for Texas, with the new map here, things get a little bit confusing. The 23rd district is relatively red. That's likely not going to be very contested. And neither are any of these other ones in the south. If anything, there is in fact actually uh, there are in fact Democratic incumbents down here, so that could potentially end up making things a bit interesting. They could potentially end up getting a bit closer, but it's probably not going to end up mattering. They're going to be red enough that it is, in fact, still going to end up basically not mattering that much. This is a vacant seat. It's a bit less than 20, but it is still enough that it is probably going to end up being a safe seat. Same thing up here. It's just a bit under 20. That's getting around the Houston area, and so that's generally going to being safe. That's kind of what Van Duyn's district looks like right now. He did win by 20, so that's going to be a bit less. And that does wrap things up for Texas. So that means 169, 159. This is a new seat that was drawn for 2024. They had to redraw the districts. They didn't have enough for the black population in Louisiana. I don't know where I got South Carolina from. So they had to draw in this new district. He only won by 13, but that's mostly because of the divided Democratic field. Now that they actually are going to have official primaries, most likely that's not going to be the case in 2026. Next up, we are going to move into Arkansas. This is a seat that actually got relatively close in 2018, and by relatively close, I mean 6.3 points. So that's going to be something relatively interesting of note there, but that's probably about as close as it's going to get. They did redraw it a little bit, not by much though. They didn't have this point up here anymore. But other than that, it is basically just going to be a safe red seat no matter what happens there. Hopping back over to Colorado, we have a few interesting seats there. We have Hurd only won by just under 5 points. Jeff Hurd in 2024. This is actually an underperformance generally. This is a little bit outer Denver area along that stripe there, and a little bit over here. So that's gonna really be the interesting thing of note there. Hurd mostly undecided. So that was in June, but basically it was expected to be lean R. It ended up being 5 points. So not a very strong performance there. Definitely going to be one of the seats that they're going to try to pick up. The one they're definitely going to go for is going to be Evans, and they definitely do have the advantage. Generally, I'd say that rematches are a bad idea, but I think that Caraveo might actually benefit from already having name recognition here, so that might actually be a good idea to run again in this what ended up being a mild upset here. So that may end up helping, even though usually it doesn't end up benefiting the party. They're relatively blue district there, only won by 14.2 though, and 13.8. I think that would probably drop below 10 in a blue year. We didn't have those sort of districts in 2018. This was a bit of a redder district. It was 17, ended up being 20, and that is Lamborn's seat. I believe they probably ended up drawing him out, or Lamborn ended up retiring in 2022. So that's what ended up happening there. Boebert's seat is almost certainly going to go under 10 at the very least, which means that there would be no Republican wins in Colorado with by less than 10 points, which would be interesting considering the most likely the statewide vote there is going to look relatively interesting. In Kansas, we have the 18.9 win in Kansas second. That's just barely enough to be under 20, but that's unlikely to actually be very low. David's only won by 10.3 here, but that's still going to be enough to show up there. Now, this is an interesting one. This was actually by over 20, but it was 20.2, just barely there, and it's the most left trending district basically in the entire country. It's still going to be over 10, but it could be somewhat interesting to see how close that could get. And then Bacon is retiring, so it almost certainly puts this in the Democratic column. Iowa is very susceptible to midterms, as we've seen in 2022. It was a not that strong red year, and then they ended up winning by 12 points in the popular vote here. We ended up having a poor candidate against Miller Meeks. Nunn ended up narrowly beating Axne. But if you look at 2018, the Democrats actually won the House vote in Iowa. And this was during the 8-point win that they won nationally. So it's very susceptible to changes. As you can also see in 2024, the Republicans won the vote here by 13. So that does absolutely show that they can end up winning relatively strongly. Now, they did redraw the district in 2022 to get out Axne, and it did end up working narrowly because he wasn't the incumbent for the area over here back in 2022. He was in this section, so you also are partially removing the incumbency status for some people. And so then we end up with, anyways, is probably going to be the benefit is mostly going to be in the first district for the Democrats. Almost a relatively strong lead as of right now. We'll have to see how polling starts going. Nunn almost narrowly potentially favored to lose that, but then Hinson's actually retiring. She's a very strong performer. With that, that's actually probably going to end up being likely. Very narrow, likely, kind of on the edge of lean, but not very. She did do relatively well. In 2022, she won by 8.2, and that was with a 3-point lead. So if we end up seeing that flip, that could be close to about 3 points or so. We're going to have to see how things continue to go from there. That's really going to be the main question. Full solid Minnesota is almost certain to just happen again, unless they end up knocking down the margin. In the 8th district a bit more. Craig is retiring to run for governor, or not governor, senator, so that's probably going to end up potentially dropping below 10 for that reason, but we'll have to see when all things start sorting out a bit. White is probably going to end up running again narrowly over 10. I'm not so sure about Stale, though. He's probably going to end up being under 10, though. He did only win by 10.2 in a very strong red wave year in 2018. He managed to do 12.3, but that was with a different map. This is actually less favorable. In 2022, he only won by 8.9, so almost certainly he is, in fact, going to win by less than 10. And I also expect that Van Orden is relatively poor candidate in general. He only won by 2.7 in this year, which actually is a bit of an overperformance what he expected, but basically everyone had expected that everyone would do relatively poorly. So that's definitely going to be the main thing there. He flipped the district in 2022 by 3.7 against after Kind retired. He lost to Kind in that basically what was the exact same district, even before the redraw. It was almost the exact same district. So, but he did end up winning against a non-incumbent in 2022 by 3.7 that actually dropped, even though the popular vote actually got a lot better for actually got a lot better for Democrats, and he actually didn't do that poorly. Interestingly enough, that actually is almost the exact opposite of what you might expect. 5 points worse for Republicans and 8 points better for Democrats. Is a 13-point shift to the left, but he actually only dropped by 1 point, which is actually really interesting in Wisconsin. But that's mainly going to be the thing there. He could potentially go down, could potentially stay up. We'll have to see. In general, next we're going to be looking at these two are going to be likely. You can't be 100% sure that they're actually going to be very, very strong. These are out in Chicago, though, so they're likely going to end up being very strong. The interesting thing, though, is that this one was only by 8.4, but in a very strong Democratic year, that's likely going to end up being there. So looking over at Missouri and Indiana, in theory, they could redraw. We're just going to be going off the assumption that they do not. Missouri Wagner would likely win by under 10, not by much, but a bit under 10. He won by 11.8 in 2022, a very, very narrow bit worse. The Democrats actually did a teeny bit worse in 2024. But if you look at 2018, it was not only a worse district for the Republicans, but also just generally a strong year, obviously, for the Democrats. They only lost by 12. This year they lost by, that's 20 points. So that's 8 points better. So that is going to be an interesting thing to watch there. Potentially, if they don't redistrict, would be Wagner's district. See how close that could potentially get. Probably not going to be able to get to flip territory. Mervyn would probably win by 10 points in a blue wave year. In 2018, it was actually a very strong performance, won by McCloskey, not Mervyn, at that point. Took over in 2020, but even in 2020, won by 16. Then they redrew the district, and it was actually a little bit closer, so that's going to harm things there. But that central Indianapolis district, very, very red, but that second district isn't competitive anymore either, so redrawn very well for the Republicans in Indiana. In Michigan, we do have McDonald Rivet almost certain to win re-election just because of the fact that it was expected to be a competitive district. Yet then she ended up going out and winning by an entire 6-point margin. So that is a very large win there. Cook Political Report had a toss-up tilt D for C analysis. Elections Daily and Crystal Ball had it lean. And Paul Judge was actually beating her in all three of the polls shown here, even Global Strategy Group, which is a Democratic aligned poll. So that was definitely overperformance. That almost certainly starts her off with a strong margin there. That's actually a deep blue district. That's actually Stevens' district right there. She is likely retiring to run for, I believe it's governor. John James is retiring. This is in theory a competitive district. It's going to be lean on the map there. If Democrats get a strong enough candidate, it could get a bit closer, but we'll have to see. That's an 11.7-point margin. That'd probably drop below 10 in a good year for the Democrats. 11.9 and then 11.7. That's very consistent. Even as the Republicans did a point better across the state, that's a bit concerning. James only won by 0.5 in 2022, interestingly enough. Barrett 3.7, relatively strong overperformance from what was expected. If we look at the predictions, he analysis said tilt D, but lean R, tilt R, lean R, lean R did win almost leading in the polls almost the exact same numbers as was in the 8th district. So that's somewhat interesting. Not as much of an overperformance, so it's not going to be as strong as that one, but going to be tilt, potentially lean, but as of right now, tilt red on the map here. Scholten is likely going to win re-election by over 10 points in a stronger blue environment. In Ohio, this is actually going to have a redraw. We went over potentially in Utah, but we'll get to that in case there is a redraw. Same thing in Utah or Ohio. Captor, this is actually generally a right trending district, especially comparing 2022 to 2024. Democrats did only a point worse, but Captor did a lot worse. Marin was a relatively strong candidate in general. And so obviously could do relatively poorly in theory in the future here. This is a potentially concerning race for the Democrats in the future. Look, based on that 37,000 vote margin in Lucas County, it got whittled down by the counties around it. And so with that, you're going to probably be concerned there. Wood County is relatively close. Generally, that's a very red county, so most likely Donald Trump did win this district. So that is, it's actually just the northern chunk, so that would explain that. But she only won that she went out of plurality without winning a majority of the vote, so that's another concern there. District used to be a lot bluer, only the blue part here. This was actually a worse gerrymander in Ohio. 1, 2, 3, 4, back when the state used to be a bit bluer, especially back over here was redrawn in 2010, and the Republicans ended up gaining a lot of seats that the Democrats had held in 2008, and then they redrew it so that they could keep a lot of those seats. The 16th actually was relatively close, but then actually ended up winning by a lot, and then 2016, 2018 actually did get relatively close in some of these outer ones, but it didn't really matter. That one was getting close. This one's been left trending. This one was right trending for a while. That is, in fact, the Tim Ryan. They redrew it again, and this is with 2022. That actually did end up flipping for Landsman, and then 2024 came around. Captor potentially going up to lose that seat. As of right now, though, just because of the blue environment and incumbency, that's only going to be tilt blue, though. Which is not good news. That's going to be safe red. If we look at this, only 12.9. That's only going to be likely, but this one's 18, so that is going to be a safe red seat there. 12, I wouldn't be surprised if that potentially goes under. That's 9.2 for Landsman, most likely going to end up being able to hold on to that seat there. And then Sykes potentially being able to win by more than 5, or potentially going completely off the cliff. So that was a little while with Ohio there. O was only won by 17.4, but most likely going to still end up being over 10 at the end of the night in 2026. Alabama, that's a district that was forced redrawn for the VRA. Looking down in Florida, we have the district that has the bluer parts of Jacksonville and then the surrounding areas being won by 14.5. This could potentially go under 10 in a blue enough environment. Most likely might not. Mills, same thing there. This is actually going to be a safe blue district down here in the 9th. In the 14th, that's going to be a safe blue district. Almost would be very surprised if Luna gets above 10. Potentially might end up being below 5. We're going to have to end up seeing how things end up looking there. Lee is going to almost certainly be below 10, but Buchanan will not. That was a misclick there. 9 and 9.9, those are almost certain to go back above 10, even though this region is right trending. Potentially that 9.1 might not. And Moskowitz will almost certainly be above 5, but not any much more above that, because that entire area is still, in fact, right trending. The gerrymandered state of Georgia is, in fact, almost entirely safe, except for this one by 12.7, which is still a relatively strong margin. Look at these two in South Carolina. Nancy Mace is retiring in this district, so that is going to end up potentially opening that up for a bit of attack by the Democrats. It did go red or blue in 2018, but that was back when it was drawn differently. And so now it's a bit more beneficial. The Republicans actually did a lot worse in the popular vote in 2024 than 2022, interestingly enough. But the districts basically were the exact same. So Wilson by 19.3, that one's not going to be an issue at all. Then we end up going up to the gerrymandered state of North Carolina. And we have basically across the board, we might have end up having issues with Edwards in the west part, Harrigan almost most certainly going to end up staying above 10 points. We end up having the outskirts here 16. That could potentially get a bit competitive, especially if the suburbs go against Trump like they did in 2018. That's going to be something very interesting to watch, is because those college-educated suburban voters are the ones who are going to be showing out in the suburbs. So that's most likely what we're going to be looking at there, not by 17.3. That could potentially end up getting low as well. And then Davis is almost certainly going to end up winning re-election, potentially by a lean margin there. Up in Virginia, we can see that Kiggins is that's somewhat of a suburban district, and with Virginia Beach and the surrounding areas outside of the cities over here in the third. But Kiggins is a relatively strong overperformer. Could potentially end up seeing her and winning here by a good bit. You end up having McClellan won by a lot. Over here, McGuire only won by 15. Potentially still end up being a safe margin. If we go back a bit, still not that poor of a margin. Good one by 5.1. That's some of the district there. That is, in fact, Spanberger, like Abigail Spanberger's district. He then ran in the 7th district, but then did not run this cycle. You end up having victories for the Democrats, most likely by likely margins up in these two, especially in the 10th district, not so much potentially in the 7th. Right now it's going to stay lean. And then Whitman probably going to end up winning by under 10, potentially probably will end up going for re-election, though, nonetheless. Up in Maryland, probably going to have safe margin for both of these. 6.3 points in the 6th district, relatively strong margin there. McBride won by 15.7 in Delaware, so that's going to be another interesting win there. Lee won by 12.8 in the Pittsburgh area, and then the one right outside that, Luzio won by 7.8. That's most likely going to end up being a likely margin. These are slightly competitive, under 20 points. Madeline Dean in Pennsylvania's 4th, 18.1. 12.4 in Pennsylvania's 6th. That's actually quite a bit of a margin down from Holohan in 16.6, 12.4. Then with Brian Fitzpatrick likely going to end up winning again, potentially by only a likely margin. He seems to have a very variable luck here. In 2018, he won the district when it was first drawn by only 2.5, but then he solidified himself in 2020, won by 13. 2022, he only won by 9.7, but that was because of part of a revolt in the suburbs again. And then 2024, he won by 12.8, likely going to go back under 10. And then we have the 3 truly competitive ones in Pennsylvania. All of these went by under 2 points. These two flipped. Breslin, you actually have the mayor of Scranton now running, potentially being able to get a lot of support in those urban regions that Democrats absolutely need that back in. But I don't see such a thing happening in McKenzie's district in 7, so there's no real strength for the Democrats there. They potentially end up splitting there. And this is a very left-trending district. Cumberland County right here is one of the few counties that shifted to the left in the state of Pennsylvania from 2020 to 2024, which means that it shifted left in respect to the nation quite a bit, and it shifted left in respect to the state by quite a bit as well. So obviously that is a relatively considerable notion there, and considering he only won by 1.3, he won by 7.7 in 2022, and the Republicans only did 2% worse in the popular vote, which means that he should have won by 5.7 or so. Instead, he won by 1.3, which means that his doom is almost certainly coming in 2026. Which is an interesting note there that could potentially finally flip for the Democrats. 17.8, and this is probably going to end up actually being over 10 points. You end up having a few up in northern New Jersey as well. A gerrymandered district over here to grab the blue over here. Well, it could be said gerrymandered could also just be getting them representation, because they end up having the red district over here. But this is what really makes it unfair, is drawing this area then into the 3rd district to make it blue. But anyways, Van Drew, 16.9 points. That's potentially going to be probably just under 10. If you look at 2018, Drew actually won it by 7.7. It was drawn a bit differently, but then you end up having a different Drew, most likely, potentially Van Drew. Probably Van Drew in 2020 ended up winning it. McKean almost certainly starts with some sort of benefit here. He generally overperforms. He ended up winning this district by 5.4, despite it was expected to be very, very competitive. Poe has a very uphill battle. It's almost certainly going to be above 5, but the thing is it's actually going to be continuing to trend to the right in respect to the state. As you can see, Democrats only won the popular vote in the state by 7.1. But in 2022, they won it by 10. he wasn't an incumbent, and that is in fact Mikey Sherrill's district. Pasquarel won by 11.4 all the way down here to 4.9. It is quite a bit of a considerable shift, so that's going to be something a bit concerning for the Democrats in the future. This is also mostly Passaic County, which is very, very right trending. Donald Trump actually managed to flip that county in 2024. Next up, we have Lawler. This is going to be the main one to watch. Lawler was originally going to run for governor, and that actually could have made it relatively competitive, but then he ended up stepping down because Donald Trump didn't want him to end up giving up this seat, and for good reason. He has done very, very well in this seat, and in 2022, the Democrats redrew the map, and they expected to do relatively well, but then there was a red wave across New York, and they ended up losing 4 seats. And so then they redrew it again to make it more beneficial to them going into 2024, and they got 4 seats back, but they did not get the 17th back. Lawler ended up winning re-election by 6.3%, relatively strong candidate. Most likely going to end up winning there by a bit. Riley does have the upper hand here as an incumbent, obviously. This was by 14.3. That's going to be a strong win for Ryan, almost certainly. Here, Mannion won by 9.1. He is, in fact, already established incumbent, almost certain to win by more than 5, potentially up to 10, depending on how things go in New York State, especially upstate, even compared to southern New York. This is generally where a lot of the margin for Kamala Harris was lost, was a lot of people not showing up to vote for her in the southern part of the state. Urban Nero by 19. That's almost certainly going to be a safe margin. This is actually a left trending district. A lot of relatively rich people here, and one of the 3 main demographics that shifted from Biden in Harris's direction in 2024 were voters over the age of 65, white college graduates, and graduates, college graduates in general, and people who made over $400,000 a year. And this is a relatively rich district, which means that almost certainly it's going to be propelled even more to the left. It could potentially end up being under 5, depending on how well things go. Basically, this district was almost unchanged. You can see a little bit was moved over here in respect for a little bit more of that blue area given to the 3rd district. But that's the only change there. That's part of why it did move 11 to 10.4. Not much of a change there, but that's the main question as far as that goes. Democrats did a little bit worse, but not by much. And then you end up with the upper hand by a little bit because of incumbency in those 2 districts. In New York, it is tied 213 to 213 right now, and there are 9 districts left up in New England. Most of them aren't actually competitive, so let's just get these ones out of the way. In Rhode Island, 31 and 16. I actually missed that one. That is, in fact, over 20. And 16, that's not going to be very competitive. We end up having one in a few in Connecticut, 16 for Courtney in the eastern part of the state, and the southern area over here, Deluro by 17.8. And then you end up going to Massachusetts. This actually isn't a very competitive seat. Keating won it by 13, which means that Democrats will get to 218 seats, meaning that they will take control of the U.S. House. But even if they win all 4, they'll only have 222, which is only 2 more than the Republicans won, which really is not that much of a House majority. So as of right now, things are not looking very good for the Democrats. Started things off with the most likely the strongest seat is going to be Connecticut. Another strong overperformer was Hayes. It was expected to be a relatively competitive district, but then Jahana Hayes did end up winning it by a relatively considerable amount. Very likely Democratic, but all the way back in 2023. Elections Daily actually was the only one that updated it in 2024 for some reason, but it was actually relatively close here. The Emerson College poll about 2 weeks before the election only had her winning by 4, and 3.9 point margin of error that definitely could have ended up being a flip, but she ended up winning by 7. So this is a relatively strong seat, could potentially end up being safe, adding to a solid blue New England, which almost is impossible considering the 2nd district in Maine. Go over to New Hampshire. Both these are relatively competitive. They're somewhat equal in PVI and such. And so 8.1 for Pappas, but he did retire, potentially probably going to still end up being more than 5 points. And Goodlander is likely going to win re-election, potentially by up to about 9 points or so. Not by that much of a margin, though. We'll have to continue seeing that. And then finally, the final seat left is Jared Golden's seat. He managed to hold on this year by 0.55%, one of the closest margins this cycle. He won in 2022 by 6, in 2020 by 6.1 as well, and flipped his seat in 2018 by 1% against Poliquin, who had won alongside. In 2012, this seat had been very blue, and it had been for a long time. This used to be a Democratic area. It used to almost be inverse. In 1994, they actually originally flipped, and you actually had the urban region that was actually red. Then 1996 came around, it was another blue wave year. 47 points for the Democrat in that second district. Then 1998 all the way through. In 2002 was a little bit close, but 2006, a very strong blue wave year, 49 and 30 points. In 2008, it was actually somewhat close, but that is Pingree, who currently holds the seat still to this day. In 2008, it was a little bit close, just a 10-point win there, 35 for McCaud. In 2010, this was a red wave year. McCaud only won by 10. So that was the beginning of the shift. McCaud actually ended up winning by less than Pingree. 2012, the district was redrawn, and so Pingree ended up winning almost 30, McCaud by 16.5. And then 2014, a huge red wave year, and you actually ended up having McCaud retire. So Poliquin did beat Kane by 5.2, went on to win re-election alongside Donald Trump on the ballot by 9.6. And on that exact same ballot in 2016, Donald Trump won by 10.3, which actually means it did underperform Trump on that ballot. So it does appear that definitely there is some movement there, but would not be there for long. Jared Golden won in 2018 by a point, won re-election by 6.1 in 2020. The district was redrawn to be, I think, a little bit bluer. And for the 2022, ended up winning against Poliquin, who he had beat 4 years prior in 2022 by 6.1 points, and then 2024 was his narrowest margin yet at 0.55% to finish this off. He is a relatively strong candidate. He continues to perform relatively well. He is somewhat of a moderate. He has consistently done well even in that Republican-leaning district, so almost relatively likely that he will end up winning re-election in his district. There is the full House map, all of those competitive districts down. And so the end result is 222 to 213. Not that's the exact same result that we had in 2022, which would mean that this would be the first ever time that there were two midterm results that were the exact same, except of course that would just be number wise, not actually the actual result for the parties themselves. So that would be a mirror of 2022, except the Democrats would have control of the House, but by only 9 seats. So still very up in the air. There are 15 seats that are expected to be very, very close across the country. So we're going to be keeping watch of all of those, and I'll keep you up to date on all of that. So make sure to subscribe, follow everywhere to stay up to date on those. Thank you all so much for watching today's video, and have a fantastic rest of your day.